On the 16th of January, 1917, a coded message slithered through transatlantic telegraph cables that would reshape the destiny of nations. In a cramped office within the British Admiralty's Room 40, cryptanalysts hunched over their desks, deciphering what would become the most consequential intercepted communication in modern history. The wireless transmission originated from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, directed toward the German ambassador in Mexico, and its contents would shatter America's resolve to remain neutral in the bloodiest conflict humanity had yet witnessed. President Woodrow Wilson had spent 2.5 years carefully navigating the treacherous waters of neutrality while Europe consumed itself in mechanized slaughter. The Great War, as it was already being called, transformed the old world into a nightmare landscape of trenches, poison gas, and industrial-scale death. Nearly 3 million men had already perished since August 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo triggered a cascade of mobilizations that plunged the continent into chaos. American public opinion remained deeply divided. Millions of German and Irish immigrants harbored no love for Britain, while business interests profited handsomely from supplying the Allied powers with food, raw materials, and munitions. Wilson himself campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "Us, he kept us out of war," narrowly defeating Republican challenger Charles Evans Hughes. The president genuinely believed America's role should be that of eventual peacemaker, not combatant. Yet beneath the surface of official neutrality, tensions mounted with each passing month. Germany's naval blockade strategy increasingly threatened American lives and commerce. The Imperial German Navy had declared the waters surrounding Britain a war zone in February 1915, warning that merchant vessels entering these areas risked destruction without warning. This unrestricted submarine warfare policy represented a radical departure from accepted naval practice, which required warships to stop merchant vessels, verify their cargo, and ensure crew safety before any attack. The policy's brutal effectiveness became horrifyingly apparent on the 7th of May, 1915, when a German U-boat torpedoed the British ocean liner Lusitania off the Irish coast. The massive Cunard liner sank in just 18 minutes, taking 1,198 souls with her, including 128 Americans. The attack provoked outrage across the United States. Former President Theodore Roosevelt thundered that it represented piracy on a scale of murder and demanded immediate military action. Wilson responded with diplomatic protests rather than declarations of war, extracting promises from Germany to modify its submarine campaign, according to historical records maintained by the National Archives. The president's measured response reflected both his pacifist principles and his understanding that America remained militarily unprepared for European-scale warfare. The U.S. Army numbered fewer than 100,000 men, ranking 17th globally, behind even Portugal. The nation possessed neither the trained manpower nor the industrial mobilization to project significant force across the Atlantic. Germany grudgingly suspended unrestricted submarine warfare in September 1915. But military pressure mounted within Berlin to unleash the U-boats once more. German military planners calculated that Britain could be starved into submission within 6 months if submarines operated without restrictions. That calculation would prove catastrophically wrong, but in January 1917, as bitter winter gripped Europe's blood-soaked trenches, desperate men prepared to gamble everything on one final strategic throw. The British codebreakers who first decrypted Zimmermann's telegram understood immediately they held dynamite in their hands. Reverend William Montgomery and Nigel de Grey worked methodically through the numerical groups, their expertise honed through months of breaking German diplomatic codes. What emerged from the mathematical fog struck them with the force of revelation. Germany was proposing a military alliance with Mexico, promising the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona in exchange for Mexican entry into the war against the United States. The message instructed Ambassador Johann von Bernstorff to approach the Mexican government with this proposal, if unrestricted submarine. Warfare brought America into the conflict against Germany. Furthermore, Zimmermann suggested that Mexico might help persuade Japan to switch sides and join the Central Powers, despite Japan's existing alliance with Britain and France. The audacity of the scheme was matched only by its recklessness. British intelligence faced a delicate dilemma. Simply handing the telegram to American officials would expose Britain's ability to intercept and decrypt German communications, potentially causing Germany to change its codes entirely. Moreover, the British had obtained the telegram by tapping American diplomatic cables, a violation of diplomatic courtesy that could embarrass both governments. The solution required elaborate misdirection. British agents concocted a cover story suggesting they obtained the telegram's full text from the German telegraph office in Mexico City, where it had been retransmitted in a less secure code. This protected both the code-breaking operation and Anglo-American relations. On the 19th of February 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour summoned American Ambassador Walter Hines Page to present him with the explosive document. Page, a fervent Anglophile who had long advocated American intervention on Britain's behalf, recognized the telegram's significance immediately. He cabled Washington with barely contained excitement, describing the German proposal as astounding and urging swift action. Historical records from the Library of Congress indicate that Wilson initially suspected the telegram might be a British forgery, designed to manipulate America into the war, a testament to the president's persistent skepticism about Allied motivations. Wilson ordered his advisors to verify the document's authenticity before taking any action. Secretary of State Robert Lansing worked through diplomatic channels to obtain confirmation, while the president wrestled with the implications. On the 1st of February, Germany had indeed announced resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, effective immediately. Within days, German submarines sent multiple American merchant vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic. The SS Housatonic became the first American casualty on the 3rd of February, followed by the Lyman M-Law and the Algonquin. Each sinking pushed American public opinion further toward intervention, but Wilson remained reluctant to abandon neutrality without overwhelming justification. The Zimmermann telegram provided exactly that justification. If Germany was actively plotting to instigate war on American soil and dismember the United States through Mexican invasion, neutrality became untenable, regardless of the president's pacifist preferences. On the 24th of February, British intelligence provided additional verification details that satisfied Wilson's concerns about authenticity. The president authorized release of the telegram to the press, and on the 1st of March, the American newspapers exploded with banner headlines revealing Germany's Mexican intrigue. The reaction exceeded even British expectations. Coast to coast, Americans who had previously opposed intervention now demanded action. The public revelation of the Zimmermann telegram ignited firestorms across American society that swept away the remnants of neutrality sentiment. In the Southwest, where memories of border conflicts with Mexico remained fresh, outrage reached fever pitch. Texas newspapers thundered denunciations of German treachery, while citizens organized volunteer militias to guard against the newly imagined Mexican threat. The proposal to return southwestern territories to Mexico struck at fundamental American identity, transforming the European war into an immediate domestic security crisis. Yet the telegram's impact extended far beyond regional anxieties. It validated suspicions that Germany represented a fundamentally aggressive power, willing to wage war through any means, including cynical manipulation of neighboring nations. The proposal to encourage Japanese defection from the Allied camp demonstrated strategic thinking that transcended European concerns, suggesting Germany aimed at global hegemony rather than merely continental dominance. Arthur Zimmermann himself compounded the damage through an extraordinary diplomatic blunder. On the 3rd of March 1917, rather than denying or deflecting the telegram's authenticity, the German Foreign Secretary publicly confirmed he had indeed sent it. Speaking to journalists in Berlin, Zimmermann defended his actions as prudent military planning, arguing that Germany had every right to seek allies wherever possible. This admission eliminated any remaining doubts about the document's legitimacy, while demonstrating remarkable tone-deafness to American sensibilities. Historical analysis from prominent scholars at Yale University suggests that Zimmermann's confirmation represented one of the most catastrophic diplomatic communications in modern history. By validating the telegram at precisely the moment when skeptics questioned its authenticity, Zimmermann united American public opinion against Germany with unprecedented effectiveness. Even previously staunch isolationists found themselves without arguments when confronted with Germany's admitted conspiracy against American territorial integrity. President Wilson moved methodically toward his fateful decision. On the 26th of February, he requested congressional authorization to arm American merchant vessels with naval guns, a measure still short of formal belligerency, but acknowledging that neutrality could no longer be maintained in its previous form. A small group of anti-war senators, led by Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, filibustered the armed ship bill to death, provoking Wilson's famous denunciation of them as a little group of willful men, representing no opinion but their own, who have rendered the great government of the United States helpless and contemptible. Wilson armed the merchant ships anyway through executive authority, citing presidential powers as commander-in-chief. Meanwhile, German submarines continued their devastating campaign against Atlantic shipping. On the 18th of March, U-boats sank 3 American vessels in a single day: the city of Memphis, the Illinois, and the Vigilancia. 15 American seamen perished, bringing the reality of war directly home to American families. The president spent long nights pacing the White House corridors, wrestling with the implications of leading his nation into the catastrophic conflict he had labored so desperately to avoid. Wilson understood that American entry would not merely add another combatant to the existing struggle, but fundamentally transform the war's character and likely outcome. The United States possessed industrial capacity that dwarfed even Britain and Germany, along with vast resources of food, raw materials, and manpower. On the 2nd of April, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stood before a joint session of Congress to request a declaration of war against Imperial Germany. The Capitol building buzzed with anticipation as legislators, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, and diplomatic representatives crowded into the House chamber. Outside, thousands of citizens gathered in the spring evening, understanding that history pivoted on this moment. Rain fell steadily on Washington, as if the heavens themselves wept for what must come. Wilson appeared grave, even anguished as he approached the rostrum. Those who knew him recognized the toll these weeks had exacted. The president, who had campaigned on keeping America at peace, now prepared to lead his nation into the greatest military conflict in human history. His address would become one of the most significant speeches ever delivered by an American president, articulating ideals that would shape international relations for generations. The president methodically outlined Germany's offenses against American neutrality and international law. He detailed the submarine campaign's ruthlessness, the loss of American lives and property, and the violation of freedom of the seas that had been a cornerstone of American foreign policy since the nation's founding. Then he addressed the Zimmermann telegram directly, describing Germany's attempted incitement of war on American soil as evidence of hostile intentions that could not be tolerated or ignored. But Wilson reached beyond immediate provocations to articulate a broader vision. The world must be made safe for democracy, he declared in the address's most famous passage. America fought not for conquest or revenge, but to defend principles of self-government and national sovereignty against autocratic aggression. He distinguished between the German people and their militaristic government, insisting that America harbored no enmity toward ordinary Germans trapped under imperial rule. According to contemporary accounts preserved by the congressional record, the speech generated complex reactions throughout the chamber. Applause interrupted Wilson repeatedly, yet some legislators sat in stony silence, unconvinced that American interests required European intervention. Chief Justice Edward White, a Confederate veteran who had fought against the United States in the Civil War 5 decades earlier, openly wept while leading the applause, symbolizing the reconciliation of North and South in common national purpose. The address concluded near midnight, with Wilson calling for full mobilization of American economic and military resources. He requested powers to raise armies through conscription, expand the Navy, regulate industries for war production, and extend credits to allied governments. The president warned Congress and the nation that victory would require unprecedented sacrifice, mobilization, and national unity. Debate consumed the following days, though the outcome was never seriously in doubt after Wilson's address. Isolationists mounted passionate final defenses of neutrality. Senator La Follette spoke for hours, arguing that American intervention served British and French imperial interests rather than genuine American security. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman ever elected to Congress, cast one of 50 votes against war in the House, declaring through tears that she could not vote to send young men to die. On the 4th of April, the Senate approved the war resolution by a vote of 82-6. The House followed on the 6th of April with a vote of 373-50. Wilson signed the declaration that same day, formally placing the United States in a state of war with Germany. Church bells rang across American cities while in military recruiting stations. Young men lined up to enlist before conscription became necessary. The United States that declared war in April 1917 was magnificently unprepared for the industrial-scale conflict it had just entered. The entire regular army numbered approximately 127,000 officers and men. Scattered across coastal fortifications, the Mexican border, and dozens of small posts nationwide, the National Guard could muster perhaps 80,000 additional troops, most with minimal training and obsolete equipment. Facing them across the Atlantic stood German armies numbering in the millions, battle-hardened through 3 years of savage warfare. The Navy was more substantial but still inadequate for the tasks ahead. The United States possessed a respectable battleship fleet but critically lacked the destroyers and submarine hunting vessels necessary to protect troop transports and merchant convoys from U-boat attack. American shipyards would need to expand dramatically while simultaneously constructing the merchant fleet required to move men and supplies across 3,000 miles of submarine-infested ocean. Secretary of War Newton Baker faced the Herculean task of creating a mass army essentially from nothing. The volunteer system that had sufficed for previous American wars could not possibly generate the millions of soldiers that European-style warfare demanded. Despite bitter opposition from those who viewed compulsory military service as fundamentally un-American, Congress passed the Selective Service Act on the 18th of May, 1917, requiring all men between ages 21 and 32 register for the draft. The registration process on the 5th of June proved remarkably successful, with nearly 10 million men registering nationwide. Careful planning avoided the draft riots that had marred Civil War conscription efforts. Draft boards operated at the local level, allowing community oversight and creating a sense that sacrifice was being shared equitably. By war's end, the United States would mobilize over 4 million men into military service. A stunning achievement given the nation's starting point. Training this enormous force presented challenges nearly as daunting as recruiting it. According to military historians at West Point, the U.S. Army possessed neither sufficient training facilities, equipment, nor experienced personnel to transform millions of civilians into combat soldiers. Vast cantonments rose from farmland across the South and Midwest, housing divisions as they formed and conducted basic training. Camp Funston in Kansas, Camp Lee in Virginia, and dozens of other installations became cities unto themselves, processing waves of draftees through abbreviated training programs. Equipment shortages plagued the mobilization from the beginning. American industry had focused on producing munitions for Allied purchase rather than developing its own military hardware. The Army lacked modern artillery, aircraft, tanks, and even rifles in sufficient quantities. Many draftees trained with wooden mock-ups of weapons until production caught up with demand. American soldiers would fight largely with French and British artillery and aircraft, a humbling reality for a nation proud of its industrial prowess. The Navy's challenges focused on combating the submarine menace that threatened to sever Allied supply lines before American troops could reach Europe. Admiral William Sims arrived in London on the 9th of April to coordinate with British naval forces and was shocked to discover that German U-boats were sinking merchant vessels faster than Allied shipyards could replace them. Britain possessed perhaps 6 weeks of food reserves, and shipping losses approached catastrophic levels. Sims advocated immediately implementing a convoy system, grouping merchant vessels under destroyer escort rather than allowing them to sail independently. British naval commanders initially resisted, arguing that convoys created larger targets and slowed overall shipping capacity. Sims eventually prevailed, and the convoy system proved devastatingly effective. Losses dropped dramatically once merchantmen traveled in protected groups, allowing essential supplies to reach Britain and France while preparing for the eventual transport of American armies. American entry into the Great War revolutionized domestic society with a speed and thoroughness that few anticipated. The conflict demanded not merely soldiers and sailors, but comprehensive mobilization of the nation's industrial, agricultural, and social resources. President Wilson and his advisors constructed a war economy that placed unprecedented government control over production, distribution, and labor relations, fundamentally altering the relationship between state and society. Congress granted Wilson extraordinary powers through a series of wartime acts that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The Lever Food and Fuel Control Act empowered the government to regulate food production and distribution, preventing hoarding and ensuring supplies reached military forces and allied nations. Herbert Hoover, a mining engineer who had coordinated Belgian relief efforts earlier in the war, became food administrator and launched a nationwide campaign encouraging meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays to conserve resources for the war effort. The War Industries Board, led by financier Bernard Baruch, exercised near dictatorial control over American manufacturing. The board determined which industries received raw materials, set production priorities, negotiated prices, and coordinated the conversion of civilian factories to military production. Automobile plants began producing trucks, ambulances, and aircraft engines. Steel mills redirected output from construction beams to artillery shells. The mobilization demonstrated industrial capitalism's capacity for rapid reorganization when directed toward singular purpose. Labor relations transformed dramatically under wartime pressures. With millions of men entering military service, labor shortages threatened production just as demand skyrocketed. The National War Labor Board mediated disputes between workers and employers, generally supporting union organizing rights and improved working conditions in exchange for no-strike pledges. Union membership soared, particularly in industries like shipbuilding and munitions production that were essential to the war effort. The labor shortage opened unprecedented opportunities for women and African Americans to enter occupations previously closed to them. Women worked in munitions factories, steel mills, and shipyards, performing heavy industrial labor that shattered Victorian assumptions about female capabilities. According to research from the Smithsonian Institution, over 1 million women entered the industrial workforce during the war years, earning wages far exceeding what traditional female employment offered. African Americans likewise found new opportunities, though embedded racism ensured they remained confined to the most difficult and lowest-paying positions, even in war industries. The Great Migration accelerated as hundreds of thousands of black Southerners relocated to northern cities seeking factory work. This demographic shift would reshape American racial geography and politics for generations, concentrating black populations in urban areas where they could exercise political power more effectively than in the Jim Crow South. The Wilson administration viewed public opinion as a weapon requiring cultivation as carefully as armies and navies. The Committee on Public Information, led by journalist George Creel, orchestrated a comprehensive propaganda campaign promoting war enthusiasm and demonizing Germany. The committee produced films, posters, pamphlets, and news stories portraying the war as a righteous crusade for democracy against barbaric Hun aggression. 75,004 Minutemen delivered brief pro-war speeches in movie theaters and public gatherings nationwide. This propaganda campaign achieved its goals, but at significant cost to civil liberties. The Espionage Act of June 1917 and the Sedition Act of May 1918 criminalized criticism of the war effort, the military, or the government. Socialist leader Eugene Debs received a 10-year prison sentence for an anti-war speech. Newspapers faced suppression for questioning government policies. Vigilante groups physically attacked suspected German sympathizers and anti-war activists with tacit government approval. German American communities suffered particularly harsh persecution. States banned teaching German in schools, orchestras refused to perform German music, and families anglicized their surnames to avoid suspicion. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage, while hamburgers transformed into Liberty sandwiches in an absurd campaign to purge German cultural influences from American life. The hysteria exposed darker currents in American nationalism that demanded conformity rather than celebrating the nation's immigrant traditions. The first American troops began arriving in France in late June 1917, though in numbers far too small to affect the military situation. The 1st Division, a regular army formation designated to lead the American Expeditionary Forces, paraded through Paris on the 4th of July amid tremendous French enthusiasm. The appearance of fresh American soldiers, even in limited numbers, provided enormous psychological boost to French morale after 3 years of devastating losses. General John Joseph Pershing commanded the American Expeditionary Forces with clear instructions from Washington to maintain American forces as a distinct and independent army, rather than allowing them to be absorbed piecemeal into French and British formations. This insistence on American autonomy created persistent tensions with Allied commanders, who desperately needed immediate reinforcements for their depleted divisions and viewed Pershing's determination to build a separate American army as dangerously wasteful of precious time. The military situation Pershing encountered in France was grim. The French army had been crippled by widespread mutinies following the catastrophic naval offensive in April 1917, which produced 400,000 casualties for negligible gains. Entire divisions refused orders to attack, though they maintained defensive positions. Only harsh discipline and promises of improved conditions contained the mutinies, leaving the French army capable of defense, but unable to mount major offensives. British forces likewise reeled from staggering losses. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 had consumed hundreds of thousands of men, including nearly 60,000 British casualties on the battle's first day alone, the bloodiest day in British military history. The ongoing offensive at Passchendaele through autumn 1917 would claim hundreds of thousands more lives while gaining a few miles of mud-soaked wasteland. Britain desperately needed American manpower, but faced similar exhaustion of its human resources. Russia's military collapse following the Bolshevik Revolution in November 1917 fundamentally altered the war's strategic calculus. The new revolutionary government immediately sought peace with Germany, eventually signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. This freed dozens of German divisions from the Eastern Front for redeployment to France, allowing Germany to achieve temporary numerical superiority in the West for the first time since 1914. German military planners recognized they possessed a narrow window in which to win the war before American forces arrived in decisive numbers. General Erich Ludendorff planned a series of massive spring offensives in 1918 designed to break British and French armies before American reinforcements could tip the balance. Everything depended on timing, and both sides understood that 1918 would decide the war one way or another. Meanwhile, American troops continued arriving in France at accelerating rates through winter and spring of 1917 and 18. By March 1918, over 300,000 Americans had reached France, though most remained in training rather than combat-ready. Historical records from the U.S. Army Center of Military History indicate that Pershing insisted on extended training periods to prepare his troops for the realities of modern warfare. Despite Allied pressure to commit Americans to battle immediately, American soldiers received their baptism of fire gradually through quiet sectors of the line. The 1st Division entered trenches near Luneville in October 1917, taking its first casualties from German artillery and raids. The experience shocked young Americans who had imagined war as adventure rather than the grim reality of mud, lice rats, and random death from shells or gas. Officers struggled to maintain discipline and morale as the romantic illusions of warfare dissolved in the trenches' squalid misery. The American forces brought fresh enthusiasm and vast resources, but also dangerous inexperience. European armies had learned painful lessons through 3 years of mechanized slaughter, developing tactical doctrines that emphasized careful coordination of infantry, artillery, and specialized weapons. American commanders, trained in open warfare doctrines, emphasizing mobility and aggression, initially dismissed these lessons as symptoms of Allied exhaustion, rather than fundamental requirements of modern combat. On the 21st of March, 1918, German forces launched Operation Michael, the first of Ludendorff's great offensives designed to win the war before American power became overwhelming. 63 divisions struck British positions along a 50-mile front near the Somme River, preceded by the most intense artillery bombardment yet witnessed in the war. Over 6,000 guns unleashed a hurricane of high explosive and gas shells that pulverized British defenses and created chaos in rear areas. German stormtroopers, specially trained in infiltration tactics, exploited the artillery's devastation to penetrate deep into British lines. Within days, German forces advanced 40 miles, the greatest territorial gains on the Western Front since 1914. The breakthrough threatened to separate British armies from their French allies and potentially roll up the entire Allied position. For the first time since the war's opening months, German victory appeared possible. Panic gripped Allied headquarters as the German advance continued. British Field Marshal Douglas Haig issued a famous order to his troops. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The crisis forced Allied commanders to finally accept unified command under French General Ferdinand Foch. whose appointment as Supreme Allied Commander on the 3rd of April provided the coordination that had been lacking throughout the war. Pershing responded to the crisis by offering American forces to Foch without conditions, temporarily abandoning his insistence on maintaining American independence. "Infantry, artillery, aviation, all that we have is yours," Pershing told Foch during the height of the crisis. American divisions began moving into line alongside French and British units. Their inexperience offset by fresh manpower and high morale. German offensives continued through spring and into summer 1918, repeatedly achieving tactical breakthroughs, but never quite reaching operational success. Operation Georgette struck in Flanders in April. Operation Blucher hit the Aisne River in May. And a final offensive toward Paris began in July. Each achieved initial success, advancing miles and taking thousands of prisoners. But German forces could not maintain momentum against Allied reserves and their own mounting exhaustion. American troops increasingly bore significant shares of combat burden through this period. The 2nd and 3rd Divisions helped contain German advances toward Paris in June. Fighting at Château Thierry and Belleau Wood, the Battle of Belleau Wood from the 1st to the 26th of June became legendary in Marine Corps history, with Marines sustaining nearly 10,000 casualties. To clear German positions from the wooded hunting preserve, a Marine officer's reported declaration that retreat, "Hell, we just got here," captured the aggressive American spirit, though at terrible cost. The German offensives had pushed Allied lines back across territory won through years of costly fighting, but Ludendorff's gamble ultimately failed. German forces suffered casualties they could not replace while advancing beyond their artillery support into devastated territory with disrupted supply lines. By mid-July 1918, the German army had shot its bolt. Having gained ground, but failed to achieve the decisive victory that circumstances demanded, Foch recognized the moment had arrived for counteroffensive. Allied forces now included over 1 million American troops, with more arriving daily. German divisions were exhausted, depleted, and stretched thin across extended fronts. On the 18th of July, 1918, French and American forces struck the western flank of the German salient near Soissons, beginning what would become known as the Second Battle of the Marne. This marked the war's turning point, the moment when Allied forces seized the initiative never to relinquish it. The Allied offensive that began in July 1918 continued with mounting intensity through autumn in what historians term the 100 Days Offensive. American forces played increasingly central roles as Pershing finally achieved his goal of fielding independent American armies operating in their own sectors. The First Army, activated on the 10th of August, numbered over 500,000 men, making it one of the largest field armies ever assembled. American forces launched their first independent offensive at St. Mihiel on the 12th of September, 1918. The objective was a German salient that had bulged into Allied lines since 1914, threatening key rail lines and hindering Allied operations. Pershing assembled 550,000 American troops supported by French colonial forces, overwhelming German defenders who had already begun withdrawing. The battle lasted for days and straightened the Allied line, though at the cost of 7,000 American casualties. More significantly, the offensive demonstrated that American forces could plan and execute major operations independently. Validating Pershing's insistence on maintaining a distinct American army, the victory boosted American prestige with Allied commanders and confidence among American troops themselves, who had proven themselves in what they viewed as a distinctly American battle, rather than as adjuncts to French or British operations. The Americans had little time to savor their victory before facing their greatest challenge. On the 26th of September, 1918, American forces launched an offensive into the Meuse-Argonne region, attempting to break through German positions in some of the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. The battle would rage for 47 days and involve over 1 million American troops, making it the largest and bloodiest campaign in American military history. The Meuse-Argonne offensive encountered fierce German resistance in heavily fortified positions among densely wooded hills and ravines. American forces suffered from inexperienced officers, coordination failures, and terrible traffic congestion as divisions attempted to move through narrow roads under artillery fire. Progress came slowly and at horrific cost. According to Department of Defense records, American forces sustained over 120,000 casualties in the Meuse-Argonne, including 26,000 killed. Heroism became commonplace as men fought through German machine gun nests and artillery barrages. Corporal Alvin York of Tennessee achieved fame by single-handedly capturing 132 German soldiers on the 8th of October after silencing multiple machine gun positions. Sergeant Henry Johnson of New York, an African-American soldier serving with a French unit due to American racial segregation policies, fought off a German raiding party with knives and grenades when his weapons failed, earning France's Croix de Guerre. While Americans struggled in the Meuse-Argonne, British and French forces achieved spectacular successes on other sectors. British forces breached the supposedly impregnable Hindenburg Line in late September. While French armies pushed forward across the Aisne, German armies fought tenaciously, but were being systematically overwhelmed by Allied numerical superiority and exhausted by years of combat. The German home front likewise approached collapse, with civilian populations starving under Allied blockade and industrial production disrupted by strikes and shortages. By October 1918, German military leaders recognized the war was lost. Ludendorff suffered a nervous breakdown and demanded that the government seek an immediate armistice. Kaiser Wilhelm II's government began armistice negotiations with President Wilson while attempting to transition Germany toward constitutional monarchy to secure more favorable peace terms. German sailors mutinied rather than sail on a suicidal final sortie against the British Grand Fleet, while revolution erupted in German cities. At 5 o'clock on the morning of the 11th of November, 1918, German representatives signed the armistice in Marshal Foch's railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The guns fell silent at 11 o'clock that same morning, ending 4 years of slaughter that had consumed perhaps 10 million lives and reshaped the world's political geography. News of the armistice triggered wild celebrations in Allied cities, with crowds flooding streets in spontaneous demonstrations of relief and joy. American casualties, while terrible, paled beside the losses sustained by European powers. The United States suffered approximately 116,500 deaths from all causes during the war, including combat, disease, and accidents. By comparison, France lost over 1,300,000 military dead, Britain nearly 900,000, and Germany over 2 million. Russia's losses exceeded 1,700,000. The war had bled Europe white, destroying the demographic and economic foundations of the old order. President Wilson sailed for Europe in December 1918 to personally lead American participation in the Paris Peace Conference, the first sitting president to travel to Europe. He received a reception approaching religious adoration, with millions of Europeans viewing him as a messianic figure who would create a just and lasting peace. Wilson's 14 points, articulated in January 1918, had promised a peace based on national self-determination, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations to prevent future conflicts. The reality of peacemaking proved far more complex than Wilson's idealistic rhetoric suggested. French Premier Georges Clemenceau sought to permanently cripple Germany to prevent future aggression, while British Prime Minister David Lloyd George balanced French security demands against concerns about creating conditions for future conflict. Italy and Japan pursued territorial ambitions that contradicted self-determination principles. Wilson found himself compromising his principles repeatedly to achieve agreement on the League of Nations, which he viewed as essential to future peace. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June, 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany. Germany lost all colonial possessions, 13% of European territory, 10% of population, and much of its industrial capacity. The German military was limited to 100,000 men, prohibited from possessing tanks, aircraft, or submarines. Most controversially, Article 231 assigned Germany sole responsibility for causing the war, providing justification for massive reparations payments that would burden German finances for decades. Wilson achieved his League of Nations, but the organization emerged compromised from birth. The covenant was embedded in the peace treaty itself, meaning nations that wished to join the League had to accept the entire Versailles settlement. More fatally for Wilson's vision, the United States Senate refused to ratify the treaty or join the League. Isolationist senators led by Henry Cabot Lodge opposed permanent American commitments to collective security, while others objected to specific treaty provisions. Wilson's stubborn refusal to accept reservations to the treaty doomed ratification. The war's consequences rippled far beyond territorial adjustments and diplomatic structures. For empires dissolved in defeat, German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, their territories spawned new nations whose borders reflected compromises between ethnic claims, strategic considerations, and great power interests. Poland re-emerged after over a century of partition, while Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia were created as multi-ethnic states. These arrangements contained seeds of future conflicts that would plague Europe throughout the 20th century. The United States emerged from the war as the world's preeminent economic power, having transformed from debtor to creditor nation. American industrial production had expanded enormously to supply Allied needs, while European industries suffered war damage and dislocation. New York replaced London as the center of international finance. American culture, from jazz to cinema, began its conquest of global markets, spreading visions of modernity and prosperity that would make the United States the 20th century's defining nation. The war accelerated profound social changes within American society. Women who had worked in war industries and supported mobilization campaigns demanded recognition of their contributions through voting rights. The 19th Amendment granting women's suffrage passed Congress in June 1919 and was ratified in August 1920. African Americans who had served in France, experiencing societies less rigidly segregated than their homeland, returned determined to challenge Jim Crow restrictions, contributing to the emerging civil rights movement. Yet the war also unleashed darker forces. The Red Scare of 1919 and 20, fueled by fears of Bolshevik revolution spreading from Russia, led to mass arrests and deportations of suspected radicals, often with minimal legal protections. Race riots erupted in cities nationwide during the Red Summer of 1919 as returning black veterans encountered renewed white supremacist violence. The Ku Klux Klan experienced revival, reaching membership in the millions by the mid-1920s. The Treaty of Versailles failed to create the lasting peace Wilson had promised. Germany emerged from the war humiliated but not permanently weakened, nursing grievances that would fuel the rise of Nazism within 2 decades. The League of Nations, lacking American participation and enforcement mechanisms, proved unable to prevent aggressive nations from pursuing territorial ambitions. Within 21 years, Europe would descend into an even more devastating conflict that would confirm the Great War as merely the first round of a prolonged struggle for global dominance. The Zimmermann Telegram and America's subsequent entry into the Great War marked the beginning of the American century. The United States had stepped decisively onto the world stage, deploying its enormous resources in a distant conflict and proving its capacity to project military power globally. Though America would retreat into isolationism during the 1920s and 30s, the precedent had been established. Never again could the United States entirely withdraw from international affairs, and the global order that emerged from the Second World War would be fundamentally shaped by American power and ideals, for better and worse.